Hi, welcome to this discussion of formal logic. So far, we've seen a little bit of formal logic when we started talking about if Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog issues. But formal logic is actually a field all to itself, and it differs from critical thinking in a variety of important ways. Sometimes the fact that formal logic is often offered as like an upper division class, if it's offered at a college, and critical thinking is often offered as a 100 level class, if it's offered at a college, can lead us to think that maybe formal logic is harder than critical thinking. In fact, it is not. That's a myth. Critical thinking is in some respects harder than formal logic because in critical thinking, as we've seen, the ultimate conclusion can appear anywhere at all, and it might even be unstated. So identifying the ultimate conclusion can pose a challenge in a course like ours. In formal logic, there is no challenge. The ultimate conclusion is always the very last sentence that you see, and it's always preceded by therefore. Furthermore, in critical thinking, the premises can show up anywhere. We might have a premise, we might have a sub-conclusion, we might have another premise and another sub-conclusion and the ultimate conclusion, right? Not so for formal logic. For formal logic, all of the premises show up first. Additionally, in critical thinking, many sub-conclusions are stated because, as we've seen, there can be a sentence like, oh, I don't know, Jack's battery is dead, therefore he's going to be late for the interview, and so he won't get the job. Where he's going to be late for the interview is a sub-conclusion, and we have to figure that out. In formal logic, that's not going to happen. No sub-conclusions are stated. So let's just think about these three facts about formal logic and just take a little think about how really artificially these arguments are going to sound, how artificially they are set up. Because what you have is just a block of premises. Premise, 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 premise. Therefore, conclusion. In real life, arguments don't look that way, right? Which is why I think that critical thinking is an incredibly useful course because it presents us with arguments more in their natural habitat, which might make you wonder, then why talk about formal logic at all? Well, there are some really good reasons. First, as we've seen in critical thinking, both premises and inferences are evaluated. And when we evaluate the argument on the basis of the premises and the inferences, they kind of fall along a continuum. One premise might be better or worse than another. One inference might be better or worse than another. But it's an analog function, right? It's not like good or bad. In formal logic, we will not look at the premises at all. We only look at the inferences. And when we evaluate them, we only evaluate them as good or bad, valid or invalid. And actually, that's why formal logic is kind of useful, because it really gets us very well acquainted, very, very fluent with those inference forms. And those inference forms are incredibly useful in real life contexts. So we might think about formal logic as almost like weight training, I suppose. You go into the gym, you do a bunch of weight training, not so that you can lift really heavy weights, but so you can help people move their sofa, right? That's what formal logic is like. It's an artificial environment, argumentatively speaking. But in acting in that artificial environment, we develop skills which are practical in very natural, non-artificial, real-world contexts. So, what do we do in formal logic? Well, we assess arguments, just their inferences, as valid or invalid by working our way from this block of premises to the ultimate conclusion by filling in the missing sub-conclusions as we go along. If we can do that, if we can go from the premises to the ultimate conclusion using only valid inference forms, then the argument as a whole is valid because each link is perfect, so the entire chain is perfect. On the other hand, if any attempt to go from the premise block to the ultimate conclusion forces us into a logical error, makes us commit a formal fallacy, then the argument as a whole is invalid because it has a weak link, right? So that's what we will be doing. The skills that we will be practicing, sort of like the weight lifting, this is what we're doing in the artificial environment so that we can easily do it in real life. Skills that we are practicing are reading one assertion at a time. You don't want to like just go on and read the entire thing. We want to deal with one assertion at a time. We want to fill in the missing subconclusions as we go along. We want to use the inference forms, and we want to remember whether those inference forms that we are using are valid or invalid. After we do a few reps of these, you will be feeling so much more comfortable with those inference forms and so much more confident deploying them in your everyday life. So next time we will take a look at the first example.